Under the vast arches of Westminster Abbey, light filters through the stained glass and paints the marble floor with shifting colors of crimson, gold, and blue. The echoes of a distant choir fade into the air as a boy stands before a tomb carved in stone. The effigy of a knight lies motionless, hands folded over a sword, his face serene beneath the crown of a prince. This was Edward, the Black Prince, the warrior hero who had conquered at Crécy and Poitiers, and whose legend still hung over England like a sacred banner. The boy's name was Richard, the son of that prince, and though he was not yet 10 years old, he would soon inherit a kingdom that had once believed itself invincible. He gazed up at the towering statues, the whisper of history surrounding him like a cold wind. His small hands were clasped, his face half lit by the colored glass, and though he could not have known it, every step of his life would be measured against the shadow of the man who lay before him. England at that moment stood between triumph and decline. The reign of King Edward III had stretched across half a century and shaped a world of knights, banners, and glory. The wars in France had given birth to legends. The victories at Crécy and Poitiers had made England a symbol of power. Yet under the gold of that triumph lay the gray of exhaustion. The fields of England had been emptied by the plague, the coffers drained by endless campaigns, and the people burdened by taxes that seemed to rise with every passing year. The Black Death had swept through villages, carrying away half the nation. Those who survived learned a bitter truth. Glory was bought with their hunger, and the songs of victory did not fill their tables. Edward III himself had grown old and weary, surrounded by sons who each sought their own measure of power. The court that had once been filled with laughter and banners now hummed with jealousy, corruption, and calculation. Among his sons, one shone brightest, the Black Prince, a warrior of unmatched valor, the man who had become the living image of chivalric perfection. But in 1376, that star began to fade. The Black Prince fell ill, his strength ebbing away in the palace where he had once received kings and ambassadors. When he died that June, the realm trembled. The old king still lived, but his body was failing, and the line of succession pointed to the prince's young son, Richard, a boy too gentle for war, too thoughtful for politics, and too untested to command men older and far more ruthless than himself. The following year, Edward III followed his son to the grave. The bells of London tolled for the end of an age. The crown that had weighed upon a conqueror's head was placed upon the brow of a child. In Westminster, under the eyes of the same nobles who had ridden with his grandfather, Richard was anointed as king. His hair was pale gold, his features delicate, his voice clear but uncertain. The crown itself was almost too heavy for him. Yet, as he stood before the altar, the air thick with incense, a strange calm filled the cathedral. Some saw a boy blessed by heaven. Others saw a kingdom stepping into peril. The government that ruled in his name was not a united council, but a gathering of ambitious men. His uncles, especially John of Gaunt, wielded real power. Gaunt was strong, seasoned, and calculating, and his influence extended beyond the court into every shire of England. For the young king, he was both protector and rival, a man who could speak to him as family, yet command him as a subject. Richard listened to debates about taxation, diplomacy, and the war with France, learning the bitter truth that a king's word was only as strong as the men willing to enforce it. In his youth, he began to study the theater of authority, how a glance, a gesture, or a pause could command obedience. The royal court, glittering with silk and gold, was also a mirror of decay. Behind every bow and every ceremony lay envy and mistrust. The treasuries were nearly empty, yet courtiers spent lavishly. Bribes circulated as easily as wine. Parliament demanded accountability, yet the powerful ignored it. Richard's tutors spoke of justice, but the boy saw how justice bent under pressure. The kingdom had grown rich on war and poor on peace. The peasants toiled harder than ever, the merchants grumbled about levies, and even the clergy whispered of divine punishment for greed. Richard's own character began to take form within this atmosphere of contrast, beauty and rot, reverence and corruption. He admired art, music, and pageantry. He believed in the sacred dignity of kingship, not as a burden of duty, but as an almost mystical calling. To him, the king was the reflection of divine order on earth, and disobedience to him was not merely rebellion, but sin. This belief, nurtured in a court of vanity and ceremony, would one day become the heart of his downfall. The ghost of his father followed him everywhere. In the great halls of Windsor, tapestries depicted the Black Prince in armor, banners fluttering at Poitiers. Minstrels sang of his courage. Even soldiers still wore his badge with pride. Richard could not escape those memories. His father had been the perfect knight. He would have to be the perfect king. If the sword had been his father's symbol, Richard chose the scepter, the crown, and the ritual. He would not conquer through battle, but through majesty. He would make kingship itself an art. But outside the royal palaces, the world moved differently. The common people of England, exhausted by war and plague, began to question the very foundations of the order that ruled them. Laborers demanded higher wages. Villagers muttered against taxes. The idea that all men were born equal before God, once whispered only by preachers, began to take root among those who tilled the soil. Parliament, sensing the shifting winds, pushed for reform and accountability. The very idea of authority was changing, and the boy who sat on the throne would soon face the storm of that transformation. The first years of Richard's reign were years of testing. The council tried to balance war and diplomacy. France was restless and peace seemed fragile. The treasury was in ruin, yet taxes continued to climb. Richard's youth made him a symbol of hope for some and a puppet for others. He grew under watchful eyes, surrounded by men who believed they could shape him. But Richard was learning something else, the art of waiting. He would smile and nod in council meetings, yet behind those soft expressions lay the first embers of defiance. When he walked through the corridors of Westminster, his footsteps echoed like a promise to himself. He would not be ruled forever by uncles and advisers. He would claim the full weight of his crown one day. For now, he watched. He learned how power dressed itself in courtesy, how it whispered through walls, and how it turned loyalty into a mask. The kingdom around him continued to strain. In the countryside, harvests faltered, and murmurs of rebellion began to spread. The common people who had paid for the king's wars began to dream of justice in their own hands. The words poll tax stirred anger like fire in dry fields, but that uprising, that reckoning, was still a few years away. For now, England drifted, caught between the memory of empire and the uncertainty of what would come next. Richard's mind, even in childhood, reached for something larger than politics. He saw himself not merely as a ruler of men, but as a chosen figure of destiny. He spent long hours in chapels, gazing at icons and candles, imagining that he was part of some divine design. His fascination with ritual and beauty made him seem distant to many of his subjects, but to Richard, these things were not vanity. They were truth. If England was to survive, it must believe again in majesty. And so the boy who once stood in silence before his father's tomb began to build an inner kingdom of his own, one of symbols, faith, and control. He did not yet know that the very qualities that made him different would one day lead others to call him arrogant, detached, even tyrannical. For now, he was still the child king, walking through corridors of power that were older than his own name. The coronation, the oaths, the processions, all were part of the theater of continuity. The nobles swore allegiance. The people cheered. Yet beneath the sound of bells and hymns, something uneasy stirred. The realm had a king, but not a leader. A crown had been placed upon a boy, but the crown itself seemed heavier than the body that bore it. In time, he would grow into it. In time, he would demand that it fit him and him alone. History would remember Richard II not for his inheritance, but for what he made of it. He would turn kingship into a vision, and that vision would both elevate and destroy him. The age of Edward III had ended in triumph and ruin. The age of Richard, Aries would begin in wonder and end in shadows. Yet from those shadows, England would learn a new language, the language of accountability, rebellion, and the fragile contract between ruler and ruled. If you've been drawn into this moment, if you can almost hear the echoes in Westminster and feel the weight of that crown resting upon a child's head, consider staying with the story, because this is only the beginning of a journey through power, pride, and downfall, a reminder of how history often repeats itself when ambition outgrows humility. Follow along, keep listening, and step with us deeper into the world of Richard II, the king who ruled beneath the shadow of glory. The years that followed Richard's coronation brought neither peace nor stability. The crown gleamed in public, but beneath it, the kingdom seethed. England was weary, bent under the burden of war, disease, and inequality. The 100 Years' War still drained its coffers, though victories were now rare. Across the countryside, men who once fought under Edward III returned home to empty fields and hungry families. Those who had survived the plague now struggled under new taxes designed to refill the royal treasury. By 1381, resentment had grown into something more dangerous, a quiet, smoldering fury. Every man and woman who worked the land could feel it in their bones. The promises of the past had died. The Black Death had not only claimed lives, it had also unbalanced society itself. Laborers, once treated as replaceable, now realized their worth. With so many dead, their hands were needed more than ever. Yet the law forbade them from seeking higher wages. The nobility and the crown enforced rigid control over work and movement. And when Parliament passed another poll tax, a flat charge on every adult, it struck directly at the poorest in the realm. Collectors roamed the countryside, demanding payment from those who had nothing left to give. In villages, resentment became defiance. Men muttered in taverns, women whispered by the well. The word justice began to take on a new and dangerous shape. It was no longer the justice proclaimed by kings and priests, but one born of toil, hunger, and memory. London itself had become a furnace of unrest. The narrow lanes of Cheapside were choked with vendors, soldiers, and beggars. The air hung heavy with smoke and sweat. Merchants grumbled of corruption, while the poor cursed the Parliament that taxed them for wars they would never fight. At every corner, someone shouted the same phrase, half complaint, half warning, "Poll tax!" The words bounced between the stone walls like sparks. Through this simmering tension, a figure began to emerge, a man not of noble birth, but of clarity and courage. His name was Wat Tyler, a craftsman from Kent. To some, he was a mere workman, to others, a voice of the people. What began as a protest against taxation soon became something far greater, a demand for justice, for equality, and for dignity. Tyler spoke simply but powerfully. He questioned why men born under the same sky should live under such different burdens. Why should those who labored for bread be taxed for wars fought by men who dined on silver plates? His message spread from town to town, carried by word of mouth and righteous anger. In Essex, in Kent, in Suffolk, villages rose together, not in chaos, but with purpose. They marched toward London, farmers, blacksmiths, masons, women carrying water and bread for their husbands. Each step of their journey bound them tighter together. Along the way, they were joined by priests and preachers who spoke of divine justice. Among them was John Ball, whose sermons struck at the heart of the social order. When Adam delved and Eve span, he declared, "Who is then the gentleman?" The words rippled through the crowds like wind through wheat. The movement was more than anger. It was a revelation. For the first time, common men and women believed they had a voice, and that voice demanded to be heard in the capital itself. As they drew nearer to London, their numbers swelled into tens of thousands. Torches lit the roads by night, and banners painted with crosses fluttered in the wind. Inside the city walls, the authorities panicked. The government's soldiers were few, and many were reluctant to fight their own countrymen. Richard, now 14 years old, was told by his advisors to flee, yet he did not. The young king, surrounded by men far older and more fearful, declared that he would face his people. Perhaps it was courage, perhaps pride. But in that moment, Richard saw not rebellion, but destiny. When the rebels reached the outskirts of London, the city trembled. Bridges were closed, gates barred, but crowds from within opened them again. The rebels flooded the streets, demanding an audience with the king. The city became a storm of voices. Chants, prayers, and accusations mingled in the smoky air. The royal ministers hid in the tower, while the young monarch prepared for a meeting that would define his reign. Richard rode out from the tower toward Mile End, his armor gleaming, the royal banner unfurled above him. Around him, thousands of faces stared, some hopeful, some furious. Yet the boy on horseback carried himself with a composure that stunned even his enemies. He listened as the crowd spoke. They wanted an end to serfdom, fair wages, and amnesty for those who had risen. Richard, speaking with the calm authority of one far beyond his years, agreed. He promised reform, forgiveness, and freedom. For a moment, peace returned. Many of the rebels dispersed, believing their king had heard them. But not all trusted the words of royal advisers who whispered behind closed doors. Wat Tyler, resolute and skeptical, remained. He would not rest until those promises were written and sealed. Days later, on June 15, 1381, another meeting was arranged, this time at Smithfield, just outside the city walls. It was here that history would shift. The scene was tense and uncertain. On one side stood the boy king with his attendants. On the other, a sea of commoners armed with staves and farm tools. Between them, Tyler rode forward, bold and unyielding. He demanded the fulfillment of every promise made at Mile End. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some say words were exchanged, harsh and defiant. Others claim Tyler made a gesture seen as threatening. In the confusion, one of the king's men struck him down. Tyler fell to the ground, wounded and surrounded. A sudden silence swept over the field. Thousands of rebels stood frozen, unsure whether to flee or to fight. It was at that moment that Richard acted with astonishing composure. The boy who had been born in the shadow of greatness stepped forward, alone before the crowd. He raised his hand and called out, "You shall have no captain but me." The words echoed across Smithfield. They carried neither fear nor anger, but authority. To the astonished rebels, it seemed as though God himself had given the boy his voice. They hesitated, and then, slowly, they lowered their weapons. The confrontation that could have drowned London in chaos dissolved into stillness. Richard rode through the crowd, speaking to them calmly, assuring them that justice would follow. Many wept. Some even knelt. They believed their young king had saved England from ruin, and for a brief, flickering moment, so did he. But promises made in the heat of crisis seldom survive the return of order. Once the rebellion dispersed, the royal council took control again. Decrees of pardon were withdrawn, leaders hunted down. John Ball was captured and executed. The dream of a just kingdom faded under the weight of authority restored. The uprising was over, but its spirit could not be buried. For Richard, the events of that summer carved deep scars into his mind. The boy who had faced the crowd as a savior began to see himself differently. He believed his courage had not only preserved the throne, but confirmed his divine right to rule. From that day forward, he would see defiance as sin and obedience as proof of loyalty. The peasants' revolt had ended, but in its ashes lay a dangerous seed, the conviction that he alone carried the will of God. England returned to uneasy peace. The nobility praised the king's bravery, yet feared the boldness that now shone in his eyes. The people went back to their fields, but they remembered. They remembered that for one fleeting moment they had stood together and spoken as equals. They remembered that a king had listened. Though their rebellion had failed, it had changed something fundamental. It had revealed that power, once questioned, could never again be absolute. In the years to come, chroniclers would call it the Great Rising. Some dismissed it as a rebellion of fools. Others saw it as the birth of conscience in a nation. And in the midst of those judgments stands the image of a 14-year-old king, his hand raised, his voice steady, standing alone between his people and the chaos they had unleashed. Richard would never forget that moment, nor would he ever forgive the fear it had brought him. In his eyes, the uprising proved that mercy could be dangerous, that the love of the people was fragile, and that authority, once challenged, must be absolute to endure. The boy who had calmed a crowd with words would grow into a man who sought to silence opposition altogether. Yet for historians and storytellers alike, that summer of 1381 remains more than rebellion. It was revelation. It showed that even the smallest voices, when united, could shake a kingdom. It showed that faith and justice, though crushed, could survive in the hearts of those who tilled the land. And it showed that a king, even in victory, could begin to lose himself. Thus ended the first great confrontation between the governed and the governing in English history. The peasants had marched for fairness and found betrayal. The king had stood for order and found pride. Each believed themselves right. Each carried wounds invisible to the world. The fire that had blazed across England was extinguished, but its embers glowed quietly beneath the surface of the realm. waiting, as all truths do, to burn again. And in the palace, under the dim light of candles, Richard sometimes dreamed of that field at Smithfield, the sea of faces, the trembling air, the moment he raised his hand and felt, for the first time, the full weight of being a king. It was not the beginning of peace, but of something far more complex, the awakening of tyranny within a soul that had once sought to save. The years after the revolt passed quietly, or so it seemed. England healed, at least on the surface. But within the marble halls of Westminster, something new began to take shape. The boy who had once faced the fury of his people was no longer a frightened child. Richard had become a young man, certain of his purpose, and convinced that he had been chosen by heaven itself. The trauma of Smithfield had not broken him. It had refined him. And out of that fire, he began to build something extraordinary. A court that shimmered with wealth, artistry, and absolute control. To understand Richard's later years, one must understand the transformation that now took hold. He did not see kingship as governance, but as revelation. Where his grandfather Edward III had ruled through conquest and the sword, Richard would rule through image, spectacle, and sanctity. The court became his canvas, and he painted upon it the vision of a world where the king was not merely first among nobles, but the living embodiment of divine authority. He surrounded himself with artists, poets, and architects, men who could shape not policy but perception. Painters were commissioned to create grand portraits of the monarch not as a man but as a celestial being. Richard in robes of gold, haloed by light, his hands raised, in blessing like a saint's. Even his coinage bore the trace of divinity, his face serene, almost angelic, a symbol of eternal order in a world that had too long known chaos. Ceremony became his language. The throne room was remade in splendor. Golden cloth draped the walls and incense perfumed the air. Every gesture of the king was measured, deliberate, choreographed. When he entered, trumpets announced his arrival not as that of a ruler, but as a revelation. Nobles were made to bow deeper, courtiers to move in precise rhythm. Every action reinforcing the truth Richard wanted England to believe, that the king was sacred. This was not vanity alone. It was armor. He had seen how fragile royal power could be. He had faced the roar of rebellion and learned that a king who walked among men could be struck down by them. And so he resolved never again to be ordinary. To rule safely, he must rule as one set apart. In his mind, distance became strength. Majesty became survival. He called himself, for the first time in English history, a divine monarch. The phrase startled even his closest advisers. To Richard, it was not blasphemy. It was truth. God had chosen kings, and among kings, none had been tested as he had. If his authority came from heaven, then to question it was not merely rebellion, but heresy. This idea began to seep into every corner of the court. Painters decorated Westminster with celestial imagery. Poets compared Richard to Solomon and even to Christ the Redeemer. The line between governance and worship blurred. The court was no longer a place of counsel. It was a temple of devotion. In the great feasts of the 1390s, the transformation was complete. The royal table gleamed with silver and crystal. Musicians played soft airs while dancers moved beneath banners embroidered with suns and stars, symbols of eternal light, of divine favor. Richard sat at the center of it all, his garments woven with gold thread, his crown heavy yet effortless upon his brow. He no longer spoke often. When he did, his voice carried the cadence of prophecy rather than command. To many, it was mesmerizing. To others, unsettling. Foreign visitors were astonished. Ambassadors from France and Bohemia wrote of a king unlike any other, a sovereign who had turned rule into theater, majesty into ritual. He seemed less concerned with armies and treaties than with the perfection of ceremony. Even justice was delivered with grandeur, trials staged in candlelight, verdicts spoken from a throne surrounded by sacred imagery. Everything was performance, every performance a declaration that the monarch was beyond reproach. Yet this dazzling vision had its cost. The very nobles who once defended him now found themselves diminished. They were no longer partners in rule, but spectators in his spectacle. Decisions were made in whispers among his favorites, men chosen not for lineage, but for loyalty to the idea of Richard's divinity. Many of these courtiers, Robert Stutz, Vere, Michael de la Pole, and others, were men of refinement and taste, but lacked the military strength and political prudence England still needed. The contrast between the radiant court and the weary kingdom beyond its walls grew sharper each year. While Richard commissioned tapestries of gold and saints' icons for his palaces, the countryside still bore the scars of plague and tax. The people who had once cheered their young savior began to murmur again, quietly, fearfully. They could not recognize in this gilded monarch the same boy who had ridden out alone to face them at Smithfield. But Richard remembered that day differently. To him, the rebellion had not been the cry of the oppressed. It had been the proof that human will was dangerous when unrestrained. He believed now that art, order, and ritual could tame that chaos. If his court gleamed brighter than any before, it was because light, he thought, must conquer shadow. If his crown was heavier, it was because it bore not merely England's fate, but heaven's purpose. At times, standing before his courtiers, Richard would pause as though lost in vision. Those who served him later said that his eyes would lift toward the vaulted ceilings as if he saw something no one else could. Perhaps he did. In those moments, he was not merely king, but priest of his own destiny. Still, beneath the splendor, unease lingered. England's nobles were men of iron and land, bred for war and politics, not for ritual adoration. They began to whisper that the king's grandeur concealed weakness, that his obsession with ceremony made him blind to the real balance of power. They had once admired him for his courage. Now they began to resent him for his distance. But Richard pressed on. He built palaces that glowed with color, sheen, Westminster and Eltham, each more elaborate than the last. The walls were lined with imagery that blurred the human and the divine. Angels bearing the Plantagenet crest, suns radiating halos of light, and inscriptions proclaiming eternal kingship. His wardrobe alone became a statement of theology. Robes of white and gold symbolizing purity, crimson cloaks for divine justice, and jewels meant to mirror the heavenly firmament. This aesthetic order became his shield against the unpredictability of the world beyond the palace gates. When famine struck, he ordered more festivals. When Parliament questioned him, he responded with greater displays of sanctity. The more uncertain the realm became, the more absolute his vision grew. And so the transformation was complete. The king who had once calmed a rebellion with words now sought to command hearts with awe. In the glittering chambers of his court, surrounded by music and incense, Richard fashioned a vision of monarchy untouched by doubt. He believed that beauty itself could hold the kingdom together, that reverence could replace loyalty, and fear could be disguised as faith. Yet even as the gold leaf shone brighter, cracks began to form beneath it. Nobles watched, waiting. Parliament grew restless. And outside the palace walls, the people whispered that the king who once walked among them now lived in a world of mirrors, so entranced by his reflection that he no longer saw the realm he ruled. But for Richard, it was too late to return. In his eyes, the divine image had already replaced the mortal man. He had become what he believed, a king sanctified by ceremony, set apart from his own creation. The court was his heaven, the crown his halo, and England, whether she wished it or not, his congregation. Beneath the splendor of Richard's court, discontent gathered like clouds before a storm. The gold-draped halls could not conceal the unease that crept through England's nobility. To the great lords, the king's vision of divine monarchy seemed not glorious, but dangerous. They saw in his sacred rituals not majesty, but distance. They whispered that Richard had forgotten the world outside his palaces, that he had replaced the language of counsel with the theater of obedience. Among those whispers rose the names of men who would soon define his fate. Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, Thomas Mowbray, Earl of Nottingham, Richard Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, and Thomas Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick. They called themselves defenders of the realm, but history would remember them as the Lord's appellant, those who appealed against the king's counselors, and in doing so, against the king himself. These men had grown up in the long shadow of Edward III, when kings still ruled with their nobles not above them. They had fought wars, commanded armies, and believed in a feudal order built on shared strength. To them, Richard's elevation of courtiers and artists over soldiers was an insult. To replace the sword with ceremony was, in their eyes, a betrayal of England's soul. Their discontent had fuel as well as form. The royal treasury, already strained, was spent on pageantry, architecture, and festivals. Meanwhile, the war with France languished. Soldiers went unpaid, and veterans returned home bitter. Parliament, pressured by the nobles, demanded accountability. They wanted to know who advised the king to squander the realm's wealth, who led him toward vanity instead of victory. At the center of their fury stood Robert de Vere, Duke of Ireland, the king's favorite, perhaps even the embodiment of everything they despised. De Vere was young, elegant, and devoted entirely to Richard. He held no great lineage, but he held the king's trust, and that was power enough to draw envy and hatred in equal measure. He was joined by Michael de la Pole, the Chancellor, Alexander Neville, Archbishop of York, and Nicholas Brembre, the wealthy mayor of London. Together, they formed the inner circle of a royal court glittering with loyalty, but detached from the realm's reality. The nobles called it corruption. Richard called it faith. In 1386, when Parliament gathered, tension erupted into open confrontation. Known later as the Wonderful Parliament, it marked the first great challenge to Richard's rule. The Commons, emboldened by the Lords, demanded that Michael de la Pole be dismissed and held accountable for mismanagement. Richard refused. The chamber fell silent, then broke into outrage. Voices rose, some pleading, some accusing. Finally, the king stood, his expression cold and still, and declared, "I will not dismiss so much as a scullion from my kitchen at your demand. The crown of England is not held of you, but of God." It was the essence of his belief, the creed of divine monarchy made flesh. But even divine kings are bound by mortal politics. Parliament refused to grant taxes unless the king yielded. Facing the threat of financial collapse, Richard gave in, though not in spirit. He swore that he would remember every name that defied him. The following 2 years became a duel between patience and vengeance. The Lords appellant, led by Gloucester and Bolingbroke, gathered support across the realm. They accused the king's advisers of treason, of misleading the crown, of betraying England's honor. Richard, for his part, fortified his loyalists and prepared for confrontation. By late 1387, both sides stood on the brink of civil war. The king sent de Vere north to raise troops. The Lords appellant marched against him. The armies met at Radcott Bridge in December. Not a grand battle, but a decisive humiliation. De Vere's forces scattered before the enemy. The king's banner fell without glory. When news reached London, Richard's authority trembled. The victors marched on the capital. The young monarch, still believing himself chosen by heaven, found himself surrounded by men who spoke the language of judgment. The nobles demanded a reckoning. In February 1388, Parliament assembled once more. The session that history would name the Merciless Parliament. The very title carried prophecy. The Lords appellant now held command of both the army and the state. Richard sat in Westminster like a prisoner upon his own throne. Before him, one by one, his friends were called to account. Michael de la Pole, the Chancellor, was accused of corruption. Alexander Neville, the Archbishop, of abusing royal favor. Nicholas Brembre, the Mayor, of tyranny in London. And Robert de Vere, the beloved Duke of Ireland, of treason. Most had already fled or been captured. Verdicts were swift, punishment swifter still. In that hall of judgment, the air was heavy with formality. The parchment crackled, the clerks read the charges, and the nobles spoke with icy restraint. The crown upon Richard's head glimmered in the torchlight, a symbol of majesty rendered powerless. For hours he listened in silence as the men who had once bowed before him now condemned his servants as traitors. When the session ended, his closest allies were gone, executed, exiled, or stripped of title. The power he had spent years centralizing dissolved overnight. The divine monarch was reduced to a spectator in his own kingdom. Yet even as humiliation closed around him, Richard's composure never fully broke. Those present recorded that he sat with hands clasped, his gaze fixed, as though watching not judgment, but prophecy. Inwardly, he began to forge a new belief. If his authority had been shattered by men, it would be restored by destiny. When Parliament adjourned, Gloucester and the other Lords appellant stood triumphant. They had humbled the crown and reinstated what they saw as proper order. a monarchy guided by its nobles. Across England the great lords feasted, believing they had saved the kingdom from tyranny, but they misunderstood the man they had humiliated. Richard did not forget. He waited. In the years to come, he would recall this moment. The torchlit hall, the echo of sentences read against his name, the cold satisfaction in the eyes of Gloucester and Bolingbroke. The memory would harden in him like iron. He had once learned that mercy could be weakness. Now he learned that patience could be power. Behind the facade of submission, Richard began to plan his return. He traveled the realm, listening, watching, rebuilding alliances among those who feared the arrogance of the nobles. He played the part of a humbled king, while quietly preparing the stage for vengeance. And as he moved through the gilded corridors of his palaces, the echoes of that parliament followed him, not as shame, but as promise. For one who saw himself as divine, defeat was never final. It was only a prelude to revelation. The merciless parliament had stripped him of his allies, but it had also given him a purpose greater than pride, the restoration of absolute kingship. And so, while the lords celebrated their triumph, Richard began to dream once more of glory, not the mortal kind won on battlefields, but the eternal kind, lit by judgment and revenge. He would forgive nothing, and when the time came, he would reclaim everything. After the storm of the merciless parliament, England seemed to drift into calm. The court glittered again, and the young king spoke softly, with a tone of patience that fooled even his enemies. The nobles believed they had won. They thought they had humbled a reckless monarch and restored order to the realm. But in truth, Richard had not been broken. He had simply learned the shape of defeat and the art of waiting. His silence was not surrender, it was the beginning of a longer game. The years that followed unfolded like the slow movement of a tide. To those who watched from afar, the kingdom appeared peaceful. There were no uprisings, no riots in London streets, no open defiance from the nobles who once had risen against him. Even Parliament, that uneasy mirror of royal authority, grew cautious in its words. Yet beneath that surface calm, Richard's will was tightening its grip around England like an invisible chain. The war with France, which had drained England for nearly 50 years, was no longer a cause for glory, but for exhaustion. The people were weary, and the nobles had little appetite for more campaigns. Richard, ever the strategist, saw in that fatigue an opportunity. Peace could serve him better than war. It could give him time to rebuild his image, to mend the cracks that rebellion had left, and to consolidate the idea that his rule was not only legitimate but sacred. He began to negotiate with France. The talks were quiet at first, almost secretive, then blossomed into diplomacy. In 1396, a truce was signed, ending hostilities for a generation. To some, it was an act of cowardice. To Richard, it was wisdom. A king who ruled by divine right, he believed, should not need to prove himself through bloodshed. He would instead prove himself through peace, through ceremony, through the artistry of kingship. That same vision guided his marriage. Years before, he had taken Anne of Bohemia as his queen. Their union was one of affection rather than politics, and for a decade she was the one soul who could soften him. Anne was gentle where Richard was proud, reflective where he was fiery. She brought grace to a court once obsessed with grandeur. Together they cultivated music, learning, and the arts. The palace halls filled with scholars and poets. The king, who had once ruled through spectacle, began for a time to rule through intellect. Yet outside the palace the people grew restless. The truce with France had brought peace, but not prosperity. Taxes remained, the scars of war lingered. The peasants who had once followed Wat Tyler into rebellion now worked their fields in silence, but their silence was not loyalty. They no longer hated Richard, but neither did they love him. He had become distant, remote, a golden figure surrounded by incense and ritual. Then, in the summer of 1394, tragedy struck. Anne of Bohemia fell ill at Sheen Palace. When she died, Richard's composure shattered. Chroniclers would later write that he ordered the palace destroyed, unable to bear the memory of her absence. It was said that he tore down the very walls where her laughter had once echoed. Whether the story is literal or not, it captures a truth deeper than stone. A part of him collapsed with her. Her death changed him. Without Anne, there was no one to temper his pride, no voice to call him back from the edge of absolutism. In her absence, his grief became a mask for something darker. The rituals of mourning turned into performances of authority. Black velvet, gilded embroidery, solemn processions, each one both an act of remembrance and a declaration of divine isolation. The king, who had once believed himself chosen by God, now began to believe he was beyond all human judgment. The courtiers who watched him grieved too, but many feared what they saw behind his sorrow. Richard withdrew deeper into ceremony, into a world where every movement was symbolic, every silence deliberate. And in that silence, he remembered. He remembered the humiliation of 1388, the way his nobles had turned on him, the sound of his friends' names being condemned in Parliament. He remembered the cold, triumphant faces of Gloucester, Arundel, Warwick, and Bolingbroke. They had called him weak. They had ruled in his name. They had forced a king to bow. Now he would rise, and he would make them bow instead. His second marriage, to young Isabel of France, was not born of affection, but of design. She was 12, a child of diplomacy, the daughter of Charles VI. The union sealed the truce with France and allowed Richard to appear as the peacemaker of Europe. But behind the outward calm, he was already setting the stage for something else. The peace gave him cover, time to reforge the crown's authority, time to isolate the nobles who still doubted him. He began to fill his council not with great lords, but with men of lesser birth, knights, lawyers, and administrators who owed their entire fortunes to the king. These men had no family armies, no independent power. Their loyalty was pure necessity. By 1397, Richard had transformed from a wounded monarch into a calculating sovereign. His court gleamed with elegance, but beneath the silken music lay the machinery of control. He had learned that domination was not only a matter of strength, but of patience, and his patience was nearing its end. Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, was the first to fall. He had been the loudest voice of defiance, the architect of Richard's earlier humiliation. One summer, under the guise of reconciliation, Richard invited him to court. The Duke came reluctantly, sensing danger but unwilling to appear disloyal. Before he reached London, he was intercepted, arrested, and sent across the Channel to Calais for safekeeping. There, far from English eyes, his life ended quietly. The official record spoke of illness. Few believed it. In London, Richard moved with a calm that frightened those around him. There was no celebration, no public outrage, only silence. When asked of Gloucester, he replied that treason was a poison that must be contained, and that the kingdom was safer for it. His tone was not cruel, merely inevitable. Then came the Parliament of 1397, the stage upon which his revenge would unfold. This time the chamber was filled with men loyal to him. The Lords appellant, who had once judged his ministers, were themselves brought forward for judgment. The same words that had condemned his friends were now turned against them. Richard sat upon his throne, his voice steady, as he spoke of betrayal, of divine order, of the duty of kings to punish rebellion. The verdicts were foregone conclusions. Richard FitzAlan, the Earl of Arundel, was condemned and executed. Thomas Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, was sentenced to life imprisonment. Thomas of Woodstock, already gone, was declared posthumously guilty. The message was unmistakable. The era of divided authority was over. Of the 5 lords appellant, only 2 remained untouched, Henry Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray. For them, Richard chose a subtler path. He restored their titles, smiled in public, and even dined with them. His charm was disarming, his forgiveness seemingly sincere. But those who had seen his rise understood that his kindness was only the surface of a deeper calculation. The court glittered brighter than ever. Musicians played, poets praised the peace, and foreign ambassadors marveled at the harmony of Richard's England. Yet beneath the harmony lay dread. The nobles bowed lower. The courtiers measured every word. The palace, once a place of laughter and art, had become a theater of reverence. Everyone played a role, and the central figure, the king, seemed almost divine, untouchable, remote. Richard no longer spoke of partnership or counsel. He spoke of destiny, of sacred order, of the crown as the heart of the kingdom and himself as its soul. The rebellion of a decade before had taught him that power shared was power diminished. He would never share again. Outside the palace, life carried on. Trade revived, the roads grew safer, the countryside quieted. To the foreign eye, England seemed blessed, a kingdom at peace, ruled by a cultured and intelligent monarch. Yet those who had lived through his early reign could sense the change. The peace was brittle, the calm unnatural, like still water before an earthquake. Richard had achieved what he had long dreamed of, a throne beyond question, a court that worshipped him, a realm too afraid to oppose him. But what he could not see, what no man wrapped in reverence can ever see, was that fear has its own momentum. The more he commanded obedience, the less he understood loyalty. The more he punished rebellion, the more he taught men to hide it rather than abandon it. In private moments, when the court was asleep and the candles burned low, Richard would sometimes walk through the silent halls of Westminster. The echoes of his footsteps followed him like ghosts. Perhaps he thought of Anne, perhaps he thought of Gloucester, or perhaps he thought of himself, the boy who had once stood alone before a rebellious crowd at Smithfield and believed that words could save a kingdom. That boy was gone. What remained was a ruler convinced that the crown itself was a divine flame, and that he alone could bear it. The vengeance he had so carefully constructed had brought him everything he wanted: respect, control, the illusion of invulnerability. Yet somewhere deep within, the same wound that had driven him still bled in silence. For in punishing his enemies, Richard had avenged his pride, not his throne. He had silenced opposition, but not secured love. The kingdom obeyed, but it no longer believed. And so, the peace he built stood shimmering and hollow, like sunlight on the surface of deep water. Beneath it, unseen, the current was already shifting, preparing to rise. For a king who sought perfection, the one thing he could never control was the hearts of men. And as the bells of Westminster rang over a kingdom outwardly content, but inwardly divided, Richard II stood at the height of his power, calm, radiant, and utterly unaware that the age he had built so carefully was already beginning to fade. By the turn of the new century, Richard's England glittered like a crown set with too many jewels, brilliant to the eye, yet heavy to bear. The court shone in golden light, but outside the palace walls the world grew dim. The king had achieved everything he once dreamed of: the silencing of his enemies, the adoration of his courtiers, the illusion of divine perfection. Yet in the pursuit of being more than mortal, he had begun to drift away from the earth itself. He no longer ruled as a statesman, but as a symbol. The crown was no longer a tool of governance, but a vessel of sanctity. Richard's speeches were not the addresses of a ruler to his subjects, but sermons of a prophet to his congregation. He spoke less of laws and more of destiny, less of governance and more of divine harmony. Ministers brought reports about trade, famine, or taxes, and the king answered them not with decrees, but with reflections on order, virtue, and eternal peace. He had become a philosopher surrounded by hungry men. Those who still tried to counsel him found themselves gently ignored. Richard listened with that famous serenity of his, nodding, smiling faintly, and then continuing exactly as before. To oppose him was not dangerous at first. It was simply futile. His will had hardened into something untouchable, like glass that shone but could no longer bend. The treasury was nearly empty. The long peace with France had brought prestige but little revenue. England's trade weakened. Ports once filled with merchants now echoed with silence. The nobility, growing restless, turned their attention inward, forming alliances, settling old feuds, and quietly preparing for the day the king's favor might falter. The peasants, once inspired by dreams of justice, now faced enclosure and displacement. Their land was bought by wealthier lords, their fields fenced for sheep, their homes abandoned to weeds. But within the marble halls of Westminster, none of this seemed to touch the king. His mind was fixed on higher things, symbols, ceremonies, the sanctity of image. He believed that if the world around him was imperfect, he could still perfect its reflection in art. He rebuilt halls, repainted chapels, and designed banners that bore his emblem, the sun in splendor, a radiant orb shining over the initials RR, Rex Richardus. It appeared on walls, on coins, even on the vestments of priests. He wanted England to see the monarchy not as government, but as revelation. Visitors to the royal court described it as something out of Scripture. The throne stood on a raised dais, its surface gilded until it seemed to glow with its own light. When Richard entered, the air filled with the sound of harps and incense. Courtiers bowed until their foreheads nearly touched the floor. The ceremonies moved with such precision that even silence felt rehearsed. To some, it was breathtaking. To others, it was suffocating. The historian Walsingham would later write that Richard reigned as if he were God among sinners. And perhaps that was exactly how the king wished it to be. The rebellion of his youth had left him with a single conviction, that obedience was the only shield against chaos. If the people could be made to worship the throne, they would never again think to challenge it. But worship and loyalty are not the same. Loyalty demands trust. Worship demands distance. And in choosing to be worshipped, Richard made himself untouchable and utterly alone. The men who still surrounded him were few and carefully chosen. Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, remained one of the last nobles Richard trusted. He was proud, ambitious, and capable, qualities Richard valued because they reflected something of himself. John Bushy, Henry Green, and William Bagot were his most constant companions, men of lesser rank who had risen through loyalty, not lineage. They shared in his secrets, managed his correspondence, and served as the guardians of his image. Together, they formed a small circle around the king, a golden wall of devotion that kept the rest of England at bay. Yet even within that circle, fear had begun to seep in. Mowbray, though loyal, was uneasy. He had seen what happened to those who once stood too close to the king's light. The more Richard demanded reverence, the more his followers whispered in private. They bowed in public and doubted in secret. To please him was easy, to satisfy him, impossible. At Westminster, the atmosphere grew tense. Courtiers smiled too often and spoke too carefully. A glance held too long could be taken as suspicion. A laugh at the wrong time could ruin a career. It was said that the palace had grown quieter, not because it was peaceful, but because everyone feared their words might be carried to the king. Richard himself seemed untouched by this unease. To those who saw him in council, he appeared almost serene, draped in gold and white, his gestures slow, his voice soft. Yet that calm masked a growing detachment. He no longer walked the streets of London as he once had, speaking with merchants or hearing petitions. He no longer visited the countryside or spoke with his people. The world of soil, trade, and struggle no longer belonged to him. He had built a kingdom of air and ceremony, where every wall reflected his glory, and every man reflected his obedience. He spoke often of peace and harmony, yet mistrust shadowed every corner of his realm. England was quiet, but it was not content. The nobles eyed each other across banquet tables, their smiles edged with calculation. The commoners muttered about taxes, about injustice, about a king who lived like a god, but seemed deaf to human suffering. The peace he had created was not the peace of balance, it was the peace of exhaustion. Still, the king believed in his vision. He believed that through grandeur, through beauty, he could transcend politics itself. He would leave behind the quarrels of men and create something eternal. And so he continued to build towers that reached for heaven, chapels filled with gold leaf, murals that painted him not as a man, but as a vision of divine kingship. To him, the crown was not a burden, but a halo. His courtiers, uncertain how to serve such a monarch, turned his beliefs into rituals. They addressed him not as your grace, but as your majesty, a term new to England, borrowed from the language of empires. Even his meals became liturgy, dishes arranged in symbolic patterns, goblets engraved with suns and stars. He had transformed the act of rule into a ceremony of faith. But while Richard built his heaven, the earth beneath it trembled. The nobles grew impatient, their loyalty eroding beneath whispers of favoritism and fear. The exiled Duke of Gloucester was dead, but his spirit lived on in his nephew, Henry Bolingbroke. Bolingbroke watched from the edge of Richard's favor, his resentment sharpening into resolve. He had learned from his father, John of Gaunt, that power rarely forgave absence and never forgave arrogance. For now, Bolingbroke waited, biding his time as the king withdrew deeper into his shining world. To many, it seemed that Richard no longer saw England as a kingdom of people, but as a stage for his divine play. The courtiers bowed, the banners glowed, the incense drifted upward. Everything moved in harmony except for the hearts of men. Those who served him began to sense that something was ending. They could not name it, but they felt it. The air of Westminster was too still, the ceremonies too perfect, the king too calm. Power, like breath, must move to live, and Richard's power had begun to stagnate. In those twilight years, even the king's closest companions began to live in quiet fear. Bushy and Green whispered behind curtains, trying to interpret each pause in the king's tone. Bagot kept careful distance, speaking only when spoken to. Mowbray, more daring, tried to warn the king that resentment was growing, that the nobles might yet unite again as they had before. Richard listened, smiled, and said that God's will would prevail. He believed it. He truly believed that divine order would protect him from mortal schemes. And perhaps that faith, once his strength, had now become his blindness. Night after night, the corridors of Westminster shimmered with candlelight, the marble floors reflecting the flicker of flame. Somewhere within those golden halls, Richard would walk alone, his footsteps echoing like a prayer unanswered. Outside, in the cold streets of London, men whispered of change. But inside, the King of England dreamed of perfection, unaware that perfection, once reached, has nowhere left to go but down. He ruled as if he were God among sinners, radiant and unreachable. And perhaps in his own mind, he was. But the realm that worshipped his image had begun to forget his touch. The peasants no longer saw him, the nobles no longer trusted him, and the silence he mistook for reverence was, in truth, the stillness before a storm. The gold on his throne still gleamed, but beneath it, the foundation was cracking. The kingdom he had built on symbols and ceremony was beginning to tremble, quietly, invisibly, like the hush that comes before the breaking of glass. But perfection, once reached, begins to rot beneath its own stillness. Within the shimmering world Richard had built, a kingdom of incense, glass, and gold, the air had grown too still to breathe. Every ritual repeated, every bow rehearsed, until even reverence turned to weariness. Beyond the palace walls, England waited, silent and watching. The people no longer prayed for the king. They endured him. The nobles no longer feared his wrath. They feared his indifference. And while Richard gazed upward toward the heavens he believed had chosen him, the ground beneath his throne had already begun to shift. By the turn of the new century, cracks that once whispered now spoke aloud. The treasury thinned, loyalty faltered, and faith, that most fragile currency, began to fail. Yet Richard, wrapped in his own radiance, could not see that the order he worshipped was unraveling. It was then that fate struck through the one man who still tethered the realm to balance, John of Gaunt. In the waning light of winter 1399, England stood at the edge of quiet decay. The court glittered still, but its brilliance no longer inspired awe. It blinded. Beneath the gold and incense, the structure of Richard's realm had begun to crack. The nobles whispered of discontent. The people murmured of taxes and injustice. And far to the north, old alliances stirred again. Yet within Westminster, Richard remained tranquil, convinced that divine order held the world steady beneath his feet. He could not see that the first tremor had already begun. The death of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, was the moment when that tremor broke the surface. Gaunt had been many things: uncle to the king, father to Henry Bolingbroke, and one of the last great stabilizing pillars of the realm. For decades, his vast estates and his quiet diplomacy had balanced Richard's temper. Even when the two men disagreed, Gaunt's presence had lent the court a kind of gravity, the reassurance of lineage and tradition. To the old duke, monarchy was not theater, it was duty. When he died in February 1399, the air around the throne seemed to shift. There was grief, but also opportunity. His death left behind one of the largest fortunes in England and a son in exile. Henry Bolingbroke, once Richard's ally, then rival, had been banished for 10 years after a quarrel with Thomas. Mowbray, he was living in France when word reached him that his father was gone. Under the law, the lands and titles of Lancaster should have passed to him. But Richard, remembering every humiliation he had endured at Bolingbroke's hands, saw a chance to erase a name he despised from English power forever. He declared the entire Lancastrian inheritance confiscated to the crown. It was a decision that astonished even his supporters. The act was more than political. It was personal, impulsive, and dangerously symbolic. In a realm where every lord saw his status as sacred, Richard had broken the unspoken covenant that bound noble and crown. If the wealth of Lancaster could be seized, then no estate was safe, no title beyond the king's reach. The court fell silent. The old families, who had long endured Richard's pageantry, now saw something else behind the gold curtain, a monarch who no longer recognized the limits of law. Letters began to pass quietly between manors. Messengers rode through the night. The seeds of rebellion were being sown, not by outrage alone, but by fear. Richard did not sense the danger. He saw himself, at last, unbound by opposition. With Gaunt gone and Bolingbroke in exile, there was no one left to challenge the divine king. He planned a campaign to Ireland, eager to assert authority abroad as he had at home. The Irish lords had risen again, and Richard viewed their defiance as a stage upon which he could perform the drama of royal might. He spoke of unity, of order, of the crown's eternal light shining across the sea. But across that same sea, in France, another drama was unfolding. Henry Bolingbroke, stripped of his inheritance, found himself a prince without a realm, a noble without a name. Exile had aged him, sharpened him. Where once he had been merely ambitious, now he was resolved. Every letter from England carried news of discontent. Lords insulted, taxes rising, the people weary of ceremony and silence. The realm that had once been Richard's fortress was crumbling into opportunity. In early summer, Bolingbroke gathered men quietly under the guise of reclaiming his lawful rights. He spoke not of rebellion, but of justice. He promised that he sought only what was his by birth, the lands of Lancaster, nothing more. Those who listened heard a tone far colder than his words. He had learned to cloak power in righteousness, ambition in legality. When Richard sailed for Ireland in May, Bolingbroke struck. He landed on the northern coast, where loyalty to Lancaster still ran deep. Villages opened their gates. Lords who had sworn oaths to Richard now rode beneath Bolingbroke's banner. His army swelled not with conquest, but with invitation. He did not march like a rebel. He advanced like a man reclaiming what was stolen. Back in Westminster, whispers grew into panic. The courtiers who had once flattered the king now watched the horizon for his rivals' banners. The very men who had enforced Richard's will began to doubt its permanence. Power, once absolute, was dissolving like gold leaf in rain. In Ireland, messengers found Richard in his tent, surrounded by maps and silken banners bearing the sun of his emblem. The letters spoke of defection, of towns opening to Bolingbroke, of nobles changing allegiance. At first, Richard dismissed them. Then came word that even the great houses of the realm, the Percys, the Nevilles, had joined Henry's cause. The divine order, it seemed, was bending toward another man. He ordered his return with haste, but the sea that had once carried him to glory now returned him to uncertainty. As his ships neared the English coast, the summer sky hung heavy and gray. For the first time in years, the king's calm wavered. He had built his reign upon the illusion that power was eternal, but the tide that greeted him that day was not one of reverence, it was one of reckoning. John of Gaunt's death had unbalanced the kingdom, but Richard's own hand had pushed it toward collapse. In seizing what was not his, he had awakened a force he could not control. Henry Bolingbroke was coming home, not as a son reclaiming inheritance, but as a prince returning for a crown. Yet even perfection has a breaking point. Beneath the glow of gold and incense, the pulse of Richard's England began to slow. The king who once ruled through pageantry now ruled through distance, a sovereign enthroned above the world, yet untouched by its heartbeat. The nobles still bowed, the priests still sang, and the sun of Rex Richardus still shone from every banner, but faith had cooled into ritual, and ritual into silence. The kingdom seemed tranquil, but it was the stillness of a surface before the ice begins to crack. Beyond Westminster's marble walls, England murmured restlessly, taxes rising, harvests failing, tempers tightening. And while Richard gazed upward toward heaven, The earth beneath his feet was shifting. The grand design of divine monarchy he had so carefully built was about to meet the one truth no king could control: mortality. For in the winter of 1399, death came not to Richard, but to the man who still anchored his kingdom to balance, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. The summer of 1399 broke with strange stillness. Across the green fields of Yorkshire, banners bearing the Red Lion of Lancaster began to rise, snapping in the wind like silent oaths. Henry Bolingbroke had returned, not as an exile sneaking home, but as a commander, moving with the calm precision of inevitability. His landing was small, almost quiet. There were no grand speeches, no proclamations of revolt. Only a few hundred men disembarked at first, veterans hardened by exile and loyalty. Yet within weeks, that number swelled into thousands. The countryside received him not as a traitor, but as a deliverer. Farmers brought food. Towns opened their gates. Those who had once cursed the heavy hand of Richard's taxation now swore allegiance to Bolingbroke's cause. The message spread faster than any army could march. The son of John of Gaunt had come home to claim what was rightfully his. But beneath that lawful veneer was something far more dangerous. A quiet understanding that Henry's justice might restore what Richard's divine rule had broken. As Bolingbroke advanced southward, the realm shifted like a compass, finding new north. Nobles who had once trembled before Richard's authority now sent word of allegiance to the rising prince. The Percys of Northumberland joined him first, lending not only men but legitimacy. Soon the Nevilles followed, then the Archbishop of York. Even the clergy, once bound to the idea of a sacred monarchy, began to whisper that perhaps God's favor had moved. Henry moved swiftly, his discipline colder than triumph. He forbade his men to plunder or harm the people. He spoke in measured tones of restoring order and the law. His march through the north resembled not rebellion, but renewal. Everywhere he went, sheriffs yielded their keys. Castles opened without a fight. The crown's writ, once unshakable, vanished before him like smoke. In the west, at Conway and Chester, royal officers hesitated, unsure whether to resist or submit. Some declared loyalty to Richard, then quietly changed their allegiance overnight. The realm had grown tired of fear, tired of grandeur, tired of a king who spoke like a god, but governed like a dreamer. Bolingbroke, in contrast, spoke plainly. He promised not visions, but justice. And England, weary and wary, began to believe him. Meanwhile, across the Irish Sea, Richard II was trapped within his own illusion. The campaign in Ireland had begun as theater, a chance to display majesty and command. He had brought with him a glittering retinue, thousands of men, banners embroidered with suns and crowns. At first, it seemed the expedition would be a triumph. The Irish chieftains submitted with little resistance, dazzled by the pageantry of English power. But the victory was hollow. The true storm was not in Ireland. It was in England gathering behind him. When the first reports reached him, Richard dismissed them as rumor. Bolingbroke, he thought, would never dare return. Yet as the weeks passed, the letters grew darker. Castles lost, noble houses defected, whole counties declaring for Lancaster. Even his most loyal men hesitated to speak the truth aloud. When the Duke of York, his uncle and regent in England, sent word that he could no longer guarantee loyalty in the capital, the illusion shattered. Richard's camp near Dublin became a place of uneasy silence. The banners that had once gleamed now drooped in the damp wind. Courtiers avoided his gaze. The king paced in his tent at night, surrounded by maps that no longer represented control but loss. Each road inked in red was another path already taken by Bolingbroke's growing force. At last, he ordered his fleet to prepare for departure. The sea crossing that had once carried him to triumph now became a desperate return. The weather was cruel. Winds turned against them. Ships scattered in fog, delaying their passage. It was as if the elements themselves hesitated to bring him home. When Richard finally landed in Wales, it was not to the fanfare of victory, but to confusion. Messengers met him with contradictory news. Some claimed Bolingbroke had only come to reclaim his inheritance, others that he already ruled London. The truth lay somewhere in between, but the tide of allegiance had already shifted beyond recall. He rode through the Welsh countryside, expecting to raise an army as his forefathers had done. But the local lords, once loyal, were silent. Some had fled, others bowed to Lancaster. The men he did gather were few, ill-equipped, uncertain. They looked to their king for guidance, and found a man caught between faith and disbelief. In those days, witnesses said, Richard's composure began to falter. The divine calm that had once surrounded him turned brittle. He spoke of destiny, of patience, of how rebellion was a shadow that could not stand before the sun. Yet behind those words was the growing realization that his own light was fading. Back in England's heartland, Bolingbroke continued his march with terrifying grace. He entered towns not as a conqueror, but as a rightful heir. Everywhere, doors opened. Even the Tower of London, symbol of royal endurance, offered no resistance. The kingdom that Richard had spent 2 decades shaping into an image of his divine will now shifted its allegiance without a single battle. When word reached him in Wales that London had fallen peacefully to Henry, Richard stared at the message for a long while. No anger, no denial, only silence. Perhaps in that stillness he understood what his courtiers could not say, that his reign had already ended long before Bolingbroke landed. The campaign that began as a quiet return had turned into a lightning conquest, swift and bloodless. In less than a season, Henry Bolingbroke had undone a generation of Richard's power, not by force, but by presence. And as the king rode through the misted hills of Wales, seeking loyal hearts that no longer existed, the realm itself seemed to whisper a single truth. England had chosen its new master, and so the thunder never came. Only the hush that follows a decision already made. As Henry's banners advanced and London yielded without a cry, the story slipped from clash to consequence. The realm had chosen, not with swords, but with open gates, and the glow of Richard's divinity dimmed into the gray of doubt. He turned west toward Wales to summon what loyalty might remain, but messengers brought only contradictions and rain. Each mile rode heavier than the last. Each map promised roads that no longer led to him. By the time the sea mist lifted from the hills, the king who had ruled by pageant was walking inside a silence of his own making, and the campaign that began as a return had become a retreat. From that quiet, the final act emerged, not in battle lines, but in the slow unthreading of belief. The final act of Richard's reign unfolded not with the roar of battle, but with the quiet collapse of belief. The king, who once ruled through spectacle and ceremony, now found himself wandering through the gray hills of Wales, surrounded by silence and mist. His banners, once radiant with gold and white, hung heavy with rain. His soldiers, cold and hungry, no longer shouted their loyalty. They only whispered their doubts. Richard had planned to rally the country as his grandfather, Edward III, once had, but there was no country left to rally. The nobles had chosen their side, and the common people, weary of taxes, wars, and ritual, had turned away. The divine monarch had built his power upon the image of eternity, yet eternity had proven fragile. Power that lived by reverence died by silence. By late July, the army that had followed him into Wales had begun to melt away. Some slipped into the forests, others simply walked home. Commanders made excuses, then vanished. Richard's most loyal officers, the men who had once sworn to die for him, now looked at their king and saw not a god, but a man who had run out of time. The royal camp emptied overnight, leaving behind banners that fluttered without meaning. In Conway Castle, where he briefly sought refuge, Richard still tried to speak with the confidence of a king. He sent messages to gather reinforcements, to summon loyalty, to remind England that he still wore the crown by divine right. But the messengers never returned. Even the sea seemed to conspire against him. The ports that once carried ships filled with treasure and armies now refused him passage. Every road led to Bolingbroke. At last, accompanied by a dwindling handful of followers, Richard rode north toward Flint Castle, an ancient fortress overlooking the Irish Sea, gray stone against a gray horizon. The journey was long and wordless. Rain fell in thin, endless sheets, soaking the royal cloak, blurring the embroidered sun that once symbolized his divine glory. The horses trudged through mud as if through memory itself. By the time they reached the castle, there was nothing left to command. His council had fled, his army had dissolved, even his servants spoke in quiet tones, uncertain how to address a king without a kingdom. Within the cold stone walls, Richard waited. He knew Henry Bolingbroke was coming. Henry's arrival was swift and disciplined. No banners flaring, no drums, no fanfare. His forces surrounded the fortress with calm precision. There was no need for battle. Richard's remaining guard opened the gates without resistance. The two men, cousins by blood, rivals by fate, were about to meet for the first time since exile had turned one into a king and the other into a claimant. The rain was falling harder now, running down the ramparts like tears carved into stone. Richard stepped out into the courtyard, his robes darkened by water, his crown left behind. Across the courtyard, Henry dismounted, his armor muted by the gray light. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the wind and the soft rhythm of rain striking earth. When Richard finally broke the silence, his voice was low, weary, almost reflective. "Cousin, I am too old to fight." It was not surrender in the ordinary sense. It was an acknowledgement, not just of defeat, but of inevitability. In that single sentence lay 22 years of reign, of pride, of ceremony, of belief in divine order. He had spent his life turning kingship into art, but art could not hold against gravity. Henry approached slowly, his expression unreadable. To his followers he was composed, almost gentle, but within that calm was the certainty of victory, the kind that needed no sword. When he bowed his head slightly, it was not homage, but the final act of a transaction long in motion. Richard's rule had already fallen. This was simply the moment it became visible. They stood together beneath the gray sky, one man in wet silk, the other in steel. There was no hatred between them, only the vast distance that power creates between those who have it and those who lose it. Around them, the world seemed to pause. The rain blurred the outlines of soldiers and stones alike, as if the earth itself refused to bear witness. When at last Richard allowed himself to be led away, there was no struggle, no resistance, no cry of defiance. He walked with a strange dignity, the kind that comes when all illusions have already burned away. Behind him, Flint Castle loomed silent, its towers fading into mist, the final backdrop of a reign that had begun with brilliance and ended in silence. In the chronicles that would later be written, some would say Richard surrendered because he was weak. Others would call it wisdom, the last flicker of grace in a life consumed by pride. But to those who stood in the rain that day, watching the fallen king and the rising one face each other, it felt like the end of something greater than a crown. It was the death of an age where kings believed themselves untouchable, and England, at last, remembered that even a god-king must bow to time. And thus the silence that closed around Flint Castle did not end with the clash of swords, but with the echo of footsteps leaving the courtyard. The rain followed Richard south, as if heaven itself refused to let the sky clear until the last act was complete. What began as surrender in stone would soon turn into judgment in the streets. From the misted hills of Wales to the crowded lanes of London, the fallen king was carried not as a captive of war, but as the symbol of a world unraveling. The throne he had treated as divine now waited for him one last time, not to crown him, but to unmake him. London awaited him like a stage prepared for tragedy. When Richard was brought south under Bolingbroke's guard, the capital, once the heart of his glory, had already turned into the theater of his humiliation. The people crowded the streets long before dawn, not in mourning, but in curiosity. They had come to see what few generations ever witnessed, a king unmade. As the royal procession moved through the city gates, there was no music, no banners, no heralds. The sound was instead a murmur, swelling into shouts as the people caught sight of him. Some cheered Henry's name, others laughed, and others merely stared in stunned disbelief. The man who had once entered London in triumphal parades, draped in gold and surrounded by fanfare, now rode slowly on a plain horse, flanked by soldiers. His robes were simple, his crown gone. The rain had followed him from Wales. It fell again, thin and relentless, washing the dust from his face, but not the weight of what he had become. He kept his eyes forward. Chroniclers would later write that Richard seemed calm, almost detached, as if the humiliation belonged to someone else. Perhaps he had already left that world of noise and judgment behind. Yet, to those watching, his silence only deepened the spectacle. A few voices called mockingly for him to bless the crowd. One man shouted, "Where is your divinity now?" Richard did not answer. He only tightened his cloak and rode on through the narrow streets that once echoed with cheers for his coronation. The people saw the downfall of a tyrant. The poets saw the tragedy of a man who believed himself chosen by heaven. Both were true. London, ever pragmatic, cared little for philosophy. It celebrated the shift of power. For years it had suffered under heavy taxes and the weight of royal extravagance. Now it cheered not out of love for Bolingbroke, but out of relief that the burden had shifted. When the procession reached the Tower of London, the gates opened wide. The fortress that had symbolized Richard's strength now became his cage. Inside its gray walls, he was lodged not as a monarch, but as a prisoner. His attendants were dismissed, his luxuries removed, and the sunlit chambers that once held banquets now felt like tombs of silence. Outside, London continued to shout and celebrate, the rain blending with the smoke of torches and the clatter of carts. But even celebration fades. In the weeks that followed, the noise gave way to something colder, procedure. Henry Bolingbroke, now calling himself Henry of Lancaster, not yet Henry IV, understood that conquest alone did not make a king. He needed legitimacy, and legitimacy required ritual. The usurpation had to be transformed into a lawful act. England's conscience, as always, would be written into Parliament. In late September 1399, the Great Council convened in Westminster Hall. The chamber was vast and echoing, lit by the pale light that filtered through tall windows. The air was heavy with expectation. Bolingbroke entered with the quiet authority of a man who already ruled, though he still claimed only to serve the realm. Richard's throne stood at the head of the hall, empty but draped with crimson cloth, as if mocking the absence of its owner. A clerk began to read the charges. They were long, formal, and deliberate. That Richard had betrayed the trust of his people, that he had governed through pride and waste, that he had allowed flattery and favoritism to corrupt the justice of the crown. Each accusation echoed in the hall like a tolling bell. Few cared for their accuracy. Their purpose was not truth, but transformation. A king could not simply fall, he had to be declared unworthy. Outside, London listened through rumor and whisper. The once sacred idea of divine monarchy was being rewritten into something new, the monarchy of consent. The spectacle was not about punishment, but about power changing form. By evening, the formal declaration was made. Richard II, by will of Parliament and by the common voice of the realm, was deemed to have forfeited the crown. In the chronicles of history, it would be called a deposition. To those who were there, it felt more like a ritual unmaking, a coronation played in reverse. No trumpet sounded, no prayers were spoken. The hall stood silent as the seal of England, once the symbol of Richard's divine right, was passed into Bolingbroke's hand. And in that moment, without a single sword drawn, a king ceased to be. The crowd outside erupted when the news spread. Bells rang, torches flared, and London, drenched in autumn rain, rejoiced. Yet among the revelry, a few older voices murmured softly that something sacred had ended. For centuries to come, England would remember that day, not only as the birth of a new dynasty, but as the moment when majesty itself was shown to be mortal. The hall at Westminster was silent, the air thick with ceremony and consequence. The echoes of Parliament's verdict still lingered in the stone, but what remained was the act itself, the ritual of surrender. It was the afternoon of September 29, 1399, when Richard II was summoned one last time to perform the gesture that would erase his crown and his name from history's present tense. He was brought into the chamber without escort, dressed in a plain robe of gray and white, the colors of mourning rather than majesty. His once bright hair hung loose, streaked with the pale dust of sleepless nights. Before him stood Henry Bolingbroke, now acclaimed by the realm as Henry IV, though not yet crowned. Between them rested the symbols of kingship, the crown and the scepter, glimmering faintly in the candlelight. Richard looked at them for a long time, as if trying to remember what they had once meant. The crown was small, elegant, and heavy with jewels, but to his eyes it seemed suddenly fragile, like a thing carved out of memory. For years he had seen it as the sign of divine favor, the vessel of his destiny. Now it was only metal, beautiful, cold, and unfeeling. The chamber was filled with witnesses, bishops, nobles, clerks, and guards. Yet the moment felt private, almost sacred. When Richard finally spoke, his voice carried not anger, but clarity, the voice of a man who had already crossed the threshold between power and reflection. "Here, cousin," he said softly, turning toward Bolingbroke, "is the crown. You are younger, stronger, and perhaps wiser in the ways of this world. Take what I have kept too long." He held the crown in both hands, its gold rim trembling faintly with the movement of his fingers. Then, in a gesture both deliberate and resigned, he set it down before Henry, not at his feet, but between them, as if to mark a boundary neither could ever truly cross. "I have wasted time," Richard said, his eyes fixed on the crown, "and now doth time waste me." The words fell like a confession, quiet, measured, and irrevocable. They were not meant for those in the hall, nor even for Henry. They were spoken to the air, to the silence that had followed him since Flint Castle, to the ghost of the world he had built from ceremony and dreams. For a long moment, no one moved. The flame of the nearest candle flickered, casting a brief shimmer across the crown's jewels. In that shimmer, it seemed as though the king, who had once believed himself eternal, was watching his own reflection fade. Bolingbroke inclined his head slightly. He did not smile, nor did he gloat. His face was calm, his eyes cautious, as if even victory in that moment felt heavy. He reached out, touched the crown, and drew it toward himself. The act was simple, almost mundane, yet it carried the weight of centuries. The scribes in the chamber began to write, recording every gesture, every word. They would later turn this quiet scene into a document of state, a lawful abdication, a bloodless transition. But those who stood there knew they were witnessing something deeper, the death of a belief that kingship could ever be divine and human at once. Richard straightened, his shoulders still regal despite the loss. "I am content," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "The crown and I are divorced. May she be faithful to her new husband." The faintest curve of irony touched his lips, not bitterness, but the weary humor of a man who had finally understood the vanity of symbols. As he was led away, he paused at the door and turned once more to look back at the throne. The sunlight through the high window caught on the crown in Henry's hands, igniting it briefly in a blaze of gold. Richard watched in silence, as though memorizing the last glimmer of a world that had belonged to him. Then he bowed, not to Henry, but to the weight of time itself, and walked into the shadows of the corridor. Outside, the bells of London began to toll. The city cheered the birth of a new reign, but within the echo of those bells was another sound, fainter, almost hidden, the echo of a man's final realization that glory is only borrowed, and time always demands its due. Winter settled harshly over England, and with it, silence. The year was 1400, and Richard of Bordeaux, once Richard II's anointed by God, crowned in gold, now lived behind the thick stone walls of Pontefract Castle. The fortress loomed in the gray light of Yorkshire, its towers rimmed with frost, its corridors echoing with the sound of distant winds. Here, the man who had ruled by spectacle was left only with shadows. The room assigned to him was small and bare, its single window narrow as a wound in the wall. A thin fire smoldered in the hearth, its warmth too faint to touch the cold that settled into the stones. The servants spoke little. Even they did not know how long he would remain, or what fate awaited him. Officially, he was in safe custody. In truth, he was a king unmade, forgotten, inconvenient, quietly dangerous. Those who guarded him said he spent hours staring at the wall, where the flickering firelight made his shadow move. Sometimes they heard him speak softly, as if in conversation with another self. "You see, we are still two," he once murmured, tracing the shape of his reflection across the stone. "One who ruled, and one who remains." There was no madness in his tone, only weariness, and the calm of a man who understood that the world had moved on without him. Outside, England adjusted to its new monarch. Henry IV, once cautious, now ruled with the pragmatism of survival. He rewarded allies, silenced critics, and watched the realm carefully for signs of unrest. But loyalty, like memory, does not fade so easily. In January of that same year, whispers began to circulate. Whispers that the old king was alive, that he was waiting, that he would return. It began as a murmur among a few nobles still loyal to Richard. The Epiphany rising. They gathered quietly, bound by old oaths and fading ideals, men who could not forget the pageantry, the belief in divine right, the idea of a king touched by something greater. Their plan was desperate but simple. During a royal tournament at Windsor, they would seize Henry, proclaim Richard restored, and sweep away the new order before it could take root. But the plot unraveled before it began. Betrayal came, as it always does, from within. One of their number sought favor with the new king and revealed everything. By the time the conspirators reached Cirencester, the royal forces were waiting. The rebellion that was meant to light the realm instead burned out in a night. When the news reached Pontefract, Richard said nothing. Those who brought the message waited for anger or tears or pleas for mercy. None came. He only nodded once, slowly, and returned to his chair by the hearth. Perhaps he had expected it. Perhaps he had stopped expecting anything at all. After that, his isolation deepened. Fewer servants attended him. The guards became more watchful. Food arrived irregularly. No letters reached him. No visitors were allowed. In London, Henry's council debated quietly what to do with the man who had once been king. To keep him alive was to invite rebellion. To let him die was to stain a reign only just begun. In politics, mercy can be more dangerous than cruelty. No record tells exactly how Richard's final days passed. Some said he was left to hunger, others that he refused food out of despair. A few chroniclers whispered that the new king had given a quiet order, though no document bears his name. History does not always deal in certainty, only in silence and consequence. What is known is this. By early February, the room at Pontefract was empty. The guards entered at dawn and found only stillness. Outside, snow fell over the castle walls, soft and soundless. His body was taken south, carefully and without ceremony. The journey from Yorkshire to London took days. Along the roads he had once traveled as a sovereign. Now his coffin moved in silence. Soldiers escorted it, but there were no banners, no hymns. The people came out to watch, farmers, merchants, beggars, children, standing in quiet lines as the cart rolled by. None shouted, none cheered. When the cortege reached London, the city that had once jeered his downfall stood wordless. The rain returned, as if completing the circle. The coffin was borne through the streets, draped in black velvet, guarded by knights whose armor reflected no light. At St. Paul's, the bells tolled low and slow. The sound was not triumphant. It was uncertain, hesitant, like a question without an answer. They buried him first at King's Langley, a quiet priory far from the center of power. Years later, when Henry's son, Henry IV, sought to cleanse the dynasty's conscience, the remains were moved to Westminster Abbey and placed beside Queen Anne, the wife Richard had loved and mourned. The gesture was meant to restore dignity to a fallen king, but it could not erase the echo of his fall. In time, stories began to spread. Some said a hermit appeared in Scotland claiming to be Richard, preaching repentance to peasants. Others insisted that his ghost walked the corridors of Westminster, still asking where his crown had gone. But legends, like kings, are built to fill the spaces that truth leaves empty. And so, when chroniclers came to write the end, they did not speak of guilt or innocence, of divine punishment or mortal flaw. They wrote instead of a question, the one his reign had forced upon England and would haunt it for generations. They buried a man, one scribe wrote, but unearthed a question. Where does power truly lie? Was it in the crown, that circle of gold he had surrendered, in Parliament, which claimed the will of the realm, in the sword which enforced it, or in the quiet acceptance of those who watched and did nothing? No one answered. The centuries that followed would try. Through wars, through reformation, through revolutions. But the question remained. Richard II had ruled as if power were eternal. His fall revealed its opposite truth, that power lives only as long as it is believed, and belief, like the man who once bore the crown, can die quietly, behind stone walls, in winter light, beneath a sky that no longer remembers his name. Centuries would pass before England could look back upon Richard II and see him not as a failure, but as a mirror. His reign, radiant in ceremony, fragile in judgment, left behind no victories, no heirs, no monuments of empire. Yet in the quiet architecture of power, in the shimmering surface of art, ritual, and kingship, his shadow endured. Richard had ruled not as a soldier, but as a visionary. In an age when kings rode to battle to prove their legitimacy, he had sought instead to define power through image. The son of the Black Prince, grandson of Edward III, he inherited a realm exhausted by war and hunger, yet he dreamed of something greater, a crown not merely worn but worshipped. To his court he brought painters, poets, musicians, and craftsmen. He commissioned portraits where he appeared haloed like a saint, and he filled Westminster with gilded glass that bathed the air in holy color. The king's body became a symbol, his gestures a form of liturgy. Historians would later see in these acts the birth of something new, the idea of sacred monarchy, a belief that the ruler was more than mortal, chosen not by blood alone, but by divine right. It was a dangerous beauty, for it demanded reverence without question. Yet the vision outlived its maker. Throughout the 15th century, England's monarchs, from Henry VI to Edward IV, borrowed from Richard's theater of kingship, the robes, the orbs, the processions, the solemn choreography that turned governance into spectacle. The Tudors, too, would later inherit that instinct, the sense that majesty was not only law, but performance. And in that performance lay the seed of the modern state. Richard's insistence on centralized authority, on the court as the beating heart of England's governance, foreshadowed the bureaucratic monarchies of later ages. The rituals he shaped to elevate himself above his nobles would, in time, evolve into institutions that bound those nobles to the crown. His vision of divine kingship, though shattered in his fall, gave form to the machinery that would outlast all divine pretensions. He had ruled as a poet of power, and poets are rarely practical men. Yet even in his downfall, Richard shaped the politics of those who followed. Henry IV, his cousin and successor, never escaped his ghost. The new king, pragmatic and cautious, found his sleep haunted by what he had taken. Chroniclers wrote that he often prayed for the soul of the man he had dethroned, not out of affection, but out of fear. Some claimed he confessed in private that the crown sat uneasily, that he had usurped not only a throne, but a destiny. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was superstition, but rebellion soon followed, as if the earth itself refused to let peace settle upon a stolen crown. The Percy family of Northumberland, powerful allies once instrumental in Henry's rise, turned against him. In 1403, Henry Hotspur Percy raised the banner of revolt, claiming to restore justice and balance to the realm. The blood of Richard's deposition still stained the soil, and from it, new conflicts grew. The rebellion failed, but the unrest endured. England had learned that a king could be unmade, and once such knowledge enters a people's mind, it never truly leaves. The divine aura of monarchy had cracked. From that fracture came both fragility and freedom, a realization that kings ruled not by heaven's decree alone, but by the consent of those they governed. Even the culture of England could not let him rest. 2 centuries later, William Shakespeare found in Richard's tragedy the perfect shape for the theater. His play, Richard II, would immortalize the fallen monarch not as villain or martyr, but as a man undone by his own vision of grandeur. On stage, Richard speaks with a lyricism too beautiful for politics, too fragile for war. His soliloquies, introspective, mournful, proud, transformed him into the archetype of the reflective king, one who understands too late the weight of the crown he once glorified. Shakespeare's Richard would weep not for the loss of power, but for the loss of meaning. "I have wasted time, and now doth time waste me," he says, a line that outlived every law and policy of his reign. In those words, England found not condemnation, but recognition, the truth that every throne is temporary, every rule borrowed from the passage of time. Through that play, Richard's spirit entered the bloodstream of English memory. He became the first modern king in tragedy, one whose defeat was internal before it was political. The stage gave him what history had denied, understanding. In the dim glow of the Globe Theater, under the flicker of candles and breath of the crowd, the fallen king lived again, not as sovereign, but as symbol. And so, centuries later, his legacy still lingers in paradox. The man who tried to make monarchy divine made it human instead. His ambition to elevate the crown above all mortal weakness revealed instead the vulnerability of kings. His reign ended in disgrace, but the questions he raised reshaped the realm. What is authority? What binds loyalty? Can power exist without belief? History has no clear answers, only echoes. If one were to imagine the closing scene of Richard's story, it would unfold not in triumph or ruin, but in quiet revelation. The camera drifts through the ruins of a castle, its walls split by ivy, its corridors open to the wind. The sunlight fades to silver as dusk gathers over stone. Somewhere in the hollow of the great hall, a single crown lies half buried in dust, its gold dimmed, its shape enduring. The wind moves through the arches like a whisper, a voice carried across centuries, and that voice, calm and reflective, might say, Richard's crown was heavy with gold, but hollow with faith. His fall marked not the end of tyranny, but the beginning of accountability. For in the silence that followed his reign, England learned to question its kings, to measure power not by splendor, but by responsibility. From the dust of divine right emerged a new idea, fragile at first, but destined to grow, that the ruler and the ruled are bound not by sanctity, but by trust. The ruins fade into mist. The whisper becomes an echo. The age of sacred monarchy has ended, and in its place, a new age begins. One where the weight of the crown is no longer measured in gold, but in the conscience of those who dare to wear it. And so the story closes, not with thunder, but with breath, the kind of silence that follows understanding. The long arc of Richard's life, from the golden halls of Westminster to the damp stones of Pontefract, reveals not simply the fall of a man, but the transformation of a nation. His reign began in splendor and ended in solitude. Yet through his fall, England learned something it had never known before, that kings are not divine, only human, and that the crown's weight is not measured in glory, but in conscience. Richard II stood at the threshold between two worlds, the medieval dream of sacred monarchy and the dawning of political accountability. In his vision of absolute majesty, he built a mirror too perfect, one that reflected not only his grandeur, but also his flaws. When that mirror shattered, the pieces scattered across centuries, each shard reflecting a truth about power, belief, and mortality. Henry IV wore the crown, but Richard defined what it meant to lose it. The centuries that followed, of rebellion, reform, and revolution, all traced their lineage back to this quiet turning point when a king knelt not before an enemy, but before time itself. Every monarch who came after walked in his shadow, aware, even if only in whispers, that the crown they held could one day slip through their fingers as easily as his had. His story became not a warning, but a meditation on pride, on fragility, on the strange beauty of a man who dared to believe that ceremony could outlast mortality. And though his body was buried and his name often judged, his question remained alive, echoing through Parliament halls, battlefields, and theaters. What is power, if not the faith others place in it? As the wind carries that question beyond the ruins of time, the final image fades. A kingdom still searching for balance between authority and humanity, between crown and conscience. The echo of Richard's voice lingers, neither triumphant nor broken, but eternal in its honesty. I was a king once, and in losing the crown, I learned what it truly meant to be human. The screen darkens, the wind subsides, history exhales, and the age of divine kings gives way to the age of man.